When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. More options should make us happier, right? The psychologist Barry Schwartz discovered the opposite. Too many choices can paralyze us, increase regret, and decrease satisfaction. This paradox of choice explains why people are more stressed in abundance than in scarcity sometimes. In disagreements, the paradox of choice makes every decision a battlefield, with infinite alternatives making any choice feel potentially wrong, or constant FOMO. Relationships can suffer from this paradox too. Dating apps offer endless options, making commitment feel like closing doors rather than opening them. Every relationship conflict can trigger thoughts of what if? What if there's someone who would have been better, easier, more fun, more compatible? This abundance of alternatives, or just the perception of the abundance of alternatives, makes working through the problem seem foolish when you could just swipe right on someone new, or swipe right on a different conversation. Even choosing a restaurant becomes fraught when there are hundreds of options. In workplace decisions, the paradox of choice can create analysis paralysis. Teams spend months evaluating software options instead of implementing solutions. Committees endlessly debate alternatives without deciding anything. The perfect becomes the enemy of the good, and the good becomes the enemy of the done. More options don't necessarily improve decisions, they can really prevent them. Understanding the paradox of choice offers some relief. Sacrificing, choosing something not good enough, or just good enough, often leads to more happiness than maximizing. Setting constraints, we'll only consider 3 options, can reduce stress and improve outcomes. In disagreements about choices, recognize that more research won't necessarily always clarify. Sometimes we gotta just choose and commit, and the best choice is often the one that you stop second guessing. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Angel Grant. Angel is the co-founder of Death Over Dinner and Drugs Over Dinner, and she has a relational coaching practice. Angel, tell us an argument story.
I try to make a practice out of truly of not letting something live rent-free in my head. You know, one of the benefits of, I've been meditating for like 25 years. And one of the benefits of that is being able to watch what is circulating or looping inside, like what thoughts are looping that maybe deplete my energy versus generate energy, and then tending to those. And so when you ask that question, first I'm like, well, we talked about it before, and there's nothing that lives really like rent-free in my head that's depleting. And however, when you ask the question too, one conflict comes up in my mind that makes me uncomfortable.
So there is a sense of you don't necessarily want to have things living rent-free. Part of your practice is non-attachment.
Right, like living in a state of completion, really. Like I've said everything I needed to say. I've listened. There's some kind of internal resolution and integrity with myself. And there's actually a recent conflict, and I don't have many conflicts really in my life at large, but there was a recent conflict, unusually, where I went outside of my own bounds of integrity with myself. And when I say integrity with myself, what I mean is I have agreements with myself and have for years. You know, I taught meditation teacher trainings and yoga teacher trainings and have this relational coaching practice. And I worked with Gabor Mate, for the love of God, like, you know, doing trauma healing retreats. And I say all this to laugh at like, looking at this as a sincere practice I have where I make a practice of not off-gassing onto other people.
Say that again?
I make a practice of not off-gassing onto other people. So when I am emotionally charged, I'm aware that any emotional charge we have as adults at this point, it's like, say, for example, that you're my ex-husband and we are communicating right now and I'm perceiving that you are being condescending.
Okay.
I would not only be agitated or mad that you are being condescending to me in this moment, and not only throughout our marriage anytime you're condescending to me, but really that would be hitting a reservoir of anything undigested that in my whole life of when someone talked down to me, way back to, say, for example, if my dad talked down to me when I was a child, that reservoir of undigested fear and anger and sadness is living inside me already. And when someone in this moment, it's like pokes that reservoir, then I am actually reacting not only to this moment, but to that whole backlog. And I find that unfair in present day relationships and just not true. And so I make a practice of like being in relationship with what's inside me and not off gassing and kind of pausing in a conflict until I can come from a more or a less like emotionally drunk place.
Well, I love that I get to be the condescending ex in this hypothetical scenario. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
The agreements with self line struck me that you just said, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And then, not to bury the lead, I want to hear about this conflict that we're trying hard to detach from as well.
So the agreement with myself is that I don't, one of them is being integrity with myself means that I am tending to my undigested stuff when it comes up in the present moment, instead of taking my attention to blame of the other person or to thinking that this other person is completely responsible for the way I feel about this conflict. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. It reminds me of questions like, what about what I'm feeling is about now? And what about what I'm feeling is, as you put it, this reservoir of undigested fear or sadness. What is about yesterday?
Yeah,
What is about now versus what is about the past?
But a lot of people, and I work with a lot of people like 5 days a week, there are plenty of people who, even if you ask that question, they're like, no, this is about now. This is about my shitty ex-husband. They're really tripled down on that.
He sounds great. Well, tell me about this conflict.
Okay. So I'm gonna be mindful because I want to respect people involved. But situation going on with someone who I love a lot in my family, who is much younger than I am. And I say that because I think there's a protective thing that came out in me for this person, even though this person is a completely capable adult. But this person is going through a divorce, and the spouse with whom they are divorcing, who I've known for 15, 16 years and grew to love because this person loved my person. But we're never super close. We're very different, But anyway, I basically verbally via text attacked the soon-to-be ex-spouse. And I use attack kind of playfully. I didn't say like, you are bad or you are this, or I didn't it wasn't to that extent, but it was way outside the bounds of how I usually communicate when I'm upset with someone. And so I've been in question. This was probably 3 weeks ago. And I acted so differently from what it's not ever in my life. And when my 20s, I was kind of, could be hot-headed when I was in a conflict or something. But at 49, in these last 15 years, I'd say, I have a very mindful practice of conflict and fail sometimes, but not to this degree in my head. And so I've been in curiosity about what I'm like, oh, wow. Even 30 minutes after it happened, I was like, I need to repair this in some way. And I didn't in the way that I normally would. And we can talk about that in a second. But the, oh, wow is like, first I tend to what's inside me, and I'm like, so I'm in curiosity of like, what threshold was crossed or what trigger was pulled inside me that was too hot for me to, do what I would usually do, which would be a more connection-based conversation. And even as I was, typing with my head going like sassy, like, there was a voice inside me that was very grounded that was saying, Angel, you don't really want to do this. Like, why don't you pause? That's my, pause. Why don't you pause? Why don't you do this? And I was just like, no. They need, and I'm like and this is the interesting part, because when we're emotionally drunk, it's like we can feel so much false power and so much like it can be precise articulation of something we want to say. It can be very different from like alcohol drunk, where it's like slurry and messy. It can be, that's why it feels so good, is because we feel like we're coming from such a clear and righteous place. And when we're really like off gassing a trauma response. And so I've been in question, about what happened in me, and I'm not to a resolution yet about the whole thing. I'm like, I'm clear that some protector rescuer came up, and some sense of like, there were a lot of lies that were told. And I am really personally, like, from early childhood stuff, triggered by untruth, And so, but I've known that, and I've worked with that for years. But this is where it goes, where I can take it from the micro to the macro of like, because like, so there was something about the lies were told, and like big ones, and breaches of integrity and betrayal and all this stuff. But where it comes to like lies, it's like, then for me, there becomes like this loss of, since I don't trust what you're saying, if I don't trust what you're saying anyway, then I watch inside me, and I'm not saying this is the right thing, but I'm just being vulnerable and saying what happened was like, then there was some kind of loss of respect, and even in the way that I communicate.
Okay.
And this isn't always the case, but this one got me, you know what I mean? Because there are people who have lied, and I know they're lying, that I can still be like connected and diplomatic with. But this one, there was this real sense of like, somebody needs to tell it like it is. And somebody needs to acknowledge that I don't believe you, and nobody believes you, and everybody, blah, blah, blah.
Right. A truth teller.
But it's this like, when there's self-righteousness in it, it's not actually ultimate truth.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's coming from, this is, I don't like to say anytime or always or never, but I would say 99% of the time when we are attempting to dominate another person, that's coming from a deep-seated insecurity. Insecurity just means absence of safety in our own skin. But that could have been, when we were 5 years old, and we learned that if we do this dominant thing, then we'll feel safer. And so that's going to pop out when some trigger is pulled inside.
So if I'm hearing you right, you behaved in a way that felt out of character for you in a moment. But in that moment, some part of you was saying, this needs to be told. And some other part of you was saying, maybe draw it back a bit or embrace the pause.
Yeah, like some other part was saying.
And then it stuck with you over time for these 3 weeks. And so one of the things, as you were talking at the beginning about your practice of meditation, in counseling, in coaching, in trauma work, in healing, et cetera, I've heard of this kind of recent debate is probably the wrong word, but I'm wondering if there's a tension between detachment and attachment to the stories we tell ourselves and to our past experiences. So in one kind of realm of thought, what we need to do is look in our minds and the stories that we tell ourselves and make less meaning out of them and say, no, the mind does what it does. It makes meanings kind of independently and it tells me I'm a bad person. But it would just sort of like smile and watch that thought drift on down the river like a leaf and not get overly invested in it and say, this has a lot of meaning and I should really work on
Absolutely.
But then there was another therapeutic practice perhaps that is like, no, that is an adaptive part. That story comes from an adaptive part. And that the story of that part is very important. And you should do deep excavation and archaeology on that part. And where does this come from? And really invest a lot of meaning into it. So as you are thinking about detaching from this or any conflict, this or any memory in your life, which of those paths really reaches you? That path of detachment and the mind does what it does, or the path of attachment that says, no, this is really serious and I should invest a lot of emotional labor in it?
I'm more of a middle road on those two because on one hand, the detaching in that first way that you talked about can really be a kind of a bypass. And when we bypass in that way of just like, but we don't tend to the internal wiring that has us be that way in the first place, then that internal wiring is going to keep running on default. And we're not going to have any agency in that spot. And so that's on one hand. And then on the other hand, as far as like hyper mining something, that tends to hold us in the past versus, I always talk to people about with trauma. And when I say the word trauma, my definition of trauma is just undigested sadness, anger, and fear. And so a lot of people kind of get afraid, like, I don't want to go relive things in the past. And I'm like, neither do I. That is not necessary or often helpful, because enough of our present moment interactions and life bring to the surface. Like anytime we have an emotional charge, there's your gateway to work with somewhere inside that you're not free. Because anytime we're in a reaction, we're not free. We're being lived by something old.
Will you say a little bit more about the somewhere inside ourselves we're not free? In other words, what are the conditions of that unfreedom? You're overly attached to a memory, or overly attached to a relationship?
Not consciously, like not in the front of the mind. What I mean is like let me think of an example. Okay. Say that I had a dominant father.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so say that I had a dominant father when I was growing up who talked down, this, I'm just sticking with the example from earlier, kind of the same thread, who talked down to me. And really, anytime somebody is condescending to a child or like yells at a child experiences humiliation. Like that's just, or an adult, like there's there's a kind of like response of someone at least trying to take your dignity, even though that person who's dominating is really, it's not about you. It's about them and their insecurities inside themselves. But a child doesn't know that, and neither do most adults. So I have a condescending, and not just condescending, but dominant father who like really kind of squashes me. And then say that I'm 49 years old and I'm driving on the interstate and someone cuts me off, speeds ahead of me and cuts me off. And say that really like gets under my skin.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? If that person is rushing to the hospital because their mother's dying and I have no idea, but I'm making it very personal that they are like, I'm experiencing it as though they are condescending to me.
Mm-hmm.
It is like an affront that they're doing to me. That is what I mean by I am not free inside. I am being lived by an experience or experiences that happened throughout my childhood or throughout earlier parts of my life, where now anytime that stuff gets tapped inside me, I'm reacting to that reservoir.
Right.
That's not freedom to me personally.
It's the weight of the past is propelling a reaction in you of which you are not in control of, nor are conscious of.
Right.
And that lack of control, lack of consciousness, you are talking about in the language of freedom, if I'm following.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Because if whatever situations can create, emotional charge in me, and that we're human, I'm not suggesting that we never have emotional charge or that there's a good and a bad or,
Mm-hmm.
But for me personally, I've been like doing this work inside myself and in question and inquiry about this for like 20 years, and watching and kind of using my life as a laboratory. My internal landscape is wildly different than it was, say, 15 years ago. And there's a whole lot more freedom. That's an experience word. You know what I mean? I'm not just like speaking like theoretically. Like I experience way more freedom when I am not just my intellect telling me, but where I'm viscerally aware that what people are doing that would have earlier seemed like they're doing something to me that's offensive, what they're doing usually has absolutely nothing to do with me, or this much to do with me.
Mm-hmm. So almost, and I've heard this phrase bandied about too, about the kind of assumption of hostile intent as we interact with other people in the world, sort of assuming being cut off in traffic is about me and not them.
Right.
And then letting that go in a way of staying not in relationship with my assumptions about that person, which according to that early kind of false binary schema that I was working up about whether we attach to these things or whether we try to detach from these things, feels like it's more in the detachment category.
And like, I wish I could think of another example quickly, but I'm not going to spend time on it. But it's like, it matters less in traffic and more in interpersonal relationships. Like if we're married or if we're close colleagues or family,
right?
Then the conflicts or the emotional charge that comes up in these relationships are often like patterns, like they repeat. I have people come to me all the time. Like I work with couples. Sometimes I work with family members, like parents and adult children. And this is my experience too. Like my last long-term partner, it was like every conflict would devolve to the same core thing. And I was just like, oh, and I could see it coming. And I'd like be like, here it comes.
It's the one big fight.
It's the one big thing where he would experience that I was doing one thing and I would experience that he was doing one thing.
Right.
And everything always boiled down to that. And it was just like, so in those ways, I wasn't free from the thing I always thought he was doing, because it really went back to someone in my childhood, just, doing this thing to me. And his went back to a parent in his childhood doing that thing to him. And so those are the ways that we are like locked up, and those lock up our present day relationships. And so in that way, I do feel that kind of mining something is valuable, but not to hang out in the mine forever.
How do you escape? I want to get back to your conflict and we'll close there. But since we're on this, the one big fight that couples or brothers and sisters or people in long-term relationships keep having, and somehow, even if it's an argument about the dishes or how to cook or where to go to dinner, it always becomes you're always trying to do this and I'm always trying to do that. What are some things that you say to people to try to escape these kinds of hamster wheel, Sisyphean conflict patterns where people feel stuck?
It becomes about a couple of things. One is say that I'm still with my ex, the scenario I just described. Then for the years that we were together, I would be like, even though I would be able to, the observer in me would know. And the one, like, I always watch patterns, relational patterns, just in humans, it's part of my work. And so even though I could see it coming like a mile, I'd be like, this is going there. In about 10 minutes, we're going to be right there. and yet I, most of the time would like, I had not yet expanded my capacity inside myself to be with sensation in that way, in that thing where I felt he was doing this thing that had been done to me before when I was a kid. The whole thing is like, there's a certain amount, like we feel sensation inside. That's the most neutral way I know how to talk about it. We feel this sensation builds up anytime right before we like rage out on someone or even shut down or do the things that we do. They're stress responses. There's sensation that is building and building and building. And then we do the thing to get out of that sensation. And so a lot of the work with yourself becomes about expanding your capacity to be with that sensation without doing the old reaction. Right. And so that was one part of it. That's one part of what I really guide people to do a lot and teach, in practices. There are practices you do with that just in your daily life that are lower stakes so that you build up the muscle for the higher stakes ones. Right.
Yeah.
And then there's the one of like this, just holding a sober voice of like, we are not in a shared reality right now. And this kind of does loop back to my original conflict that I was talking about, because as I've been in question about what allowed me to disrespect that person, because I was disrespectful and to not really honor them as a human, which is a big part of what I want to do with humans, no matter if we disagree, was that part of like, there has to be our brain works heavily on a reward system, and there has to be a reward, like not has to be, but it really helps when there's an outcome that would be a high enough reward that would have me act a certain way inside the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it's a relationship that's still current and that you don't want to end, or you care that it ends with care,
Mm-hmm.
then that can be the reward of me acknowledging, like with my ex, sometimes I could say, hey, we're not some version of like, we're not in a shared reality right now. We're both in like distortion field.
Mm-hmm.
Can't, like, I think I love you and you love me, and we should pause this, take some time, and so that we can somehow find our way back to a shared reality. To even without shared reality, there's no resolution. And so with this conflict 3 weeks ago, I think there wasn't in my mind a high enough reward for an outcome. Like I'm not going to have to see this person often. So like I can get right with myself without getting right with them. And yeah, does that all make sense?
It does. I appreciate you sharing that. As we're close, I have a question about the way that I hear you talk about emotion, memory, and conflict, and wanted to get your thoughts on it. So I noticed that you pretty consistently use food and beverage metaphors to talk about emotion. So there's two binaries that I'm hearing. One is the sober voice versus being emotionally drunk.
Yeah.
One is digested versus undigested.
Oh, interesting.
So at least those two, maybe others, but at least those two, when we talk about being blended with a part, perhaps being in, as you put it, a distortion field as we relate to conflict, as we relate to emotion. So what is it that about the way that you talk about emotion and the kind of somatic sense of how we're feeling that reaches for food and beverage metaphors?
I think it is more, I had never thought about it in that way, of food and beverage metaphors. I think that it's more of, over the years, learning to talk to people in ways that are more pragmatic.
Okay.
Because a lot of people don't have somatic, what Gabor, my mentor, he talks about as like biological intelligence. I think that with a lot of our religions, which have, I grew up hearing the body is bad. And so in these ways, and then I'll use another example of a lot of boys, at least ones I grew up with in the Deep South, being taught that like feeling is bad, like crying is bad. Mm-hmm. Crying is like peeing, like it's something your body needs to do to release something. Like crying releases cortisol, which is a stress hormone. It needs to come out sometimes. Like it's silly to be like, don't cry. But all that to say, it's like we have these really strong messages that we have been like very heavily programmed with, that have us disconnect from feeling our body and the wisdom that comes through our body. Mm-hmm. And so when I can take it down to something like, a lot of people know what it feels like to be drunk. A lot of people know what it feels like to digest food versus have food not digested. And so it's more of a pragmatic ground to meet on, probably.
Yeah, it sounds like a very pragmatic metaphor to use as an analogy to take some high-level psychological concepts and make them actionable.
Yeah.
But it also really calls attention to the physical process of moving through emotions.
Which is, yes, very important. It's funny that you say this and we're ending, but one of the things, like, I almost talked about your event and something that Trey Gowdy said at the beginning of this that is completely about this whole topic. And so it was just like, Trey said something like, I think he was talking, I don't even remember exactly for sure, but I think he was talking about when he's kind of mentoring younger attorneys in his firm. And he said, he may have been talking about students, I'm not sure, but he was in that way where he's the teacher. And he said, I don't let them say, I feel. They can say, I think or I believe, but feeling is unreliable. And I was like, there it is. Like, because during the whole conversation, I was like, he's so thoughtful. How do he and I disagree so strongly about these one or two things that I know we disagree about? And when he said that, I was like, oh, it's the detachment from the felt sense. It's the detachment from body wisdom. It's the like our body, like that's what allows us to harm other people, is a detachment from feeling. Because a person who can feel heals themselves. A world that can feel heals itself. But when we're cut off from feeling and we think that our thoughts aren't distorted, that's bananas. Like then we can rationalize hurting other people. But our body, if we're really connected, our body is saying no.
Yeah, and I took that to be in a sense of he was interested in proof.
Right.
And facts. And then what we're talking about is a very different set of operations.
Yes.
It seems to me that we're talking about, not the facts as I see them, but the stories that I tell myself about the facts of the world and the importance of acknowledging that within myself and then honoring that in other people, even as we try to figure out what's true and what's false.
Yeah, I agree. And it struck me so deeply because for me, I've gone to the depths of visceral feeling so much in myself that it's taken me into many times over the past 20 years. It's taken me into actually memories of something traumatic that I did, that I was like, wow, that is still in here. And seeing how it informs how I perceive other people and how I perceive what other people mean and what they're saying. And so that I'm a huge advocate for increasing your biological intelligence, as Gabor calls it. And in the sense that Trey said it, I still stand by what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah.
Because everything that we think and believe, our beliefs are so heavily conditioned. And he's saying, I believe is okay, and in this, but even the way I perceive the facts are still going to be distorted. Yeah.
Angel Grant, thank you so much for being on When We Disagree.
Thank you.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.